So I've said a million times that when you put a plant into a pot, you don't want to go up more than an inch or two of pot size. And I also contradicted myself earlier today doing some Instagram questions where I said I move plants to bigger pots to make them grow faster. So I want to show what I'm talking about and why my situation is a little different than I would even do that. So in general, when you're growing a plant at home, I always say go up about an inch or two bigger than the previous pot size, or I say, a little bit larger than the root system. The reason I say that is because when you repot this plant and it gets light and it uses that light to start growing roots, the plant will start growing the roots to the empty areas of the pot. And that way, there's never really too much area if you don't go up too much in pot size where the roots won't have access to. Eventually, that does mean that you'll need to repot faster as these roots start hitting the sides of the pot and eventually become root bound. And a root bound plant is fine. It honestly just means you usually have to water more often because it's absorbing all the water quickly. So I said I put plants in pots that are much bigger in my grow tent. But why you shouldn't do that at home is you take this pot now and we're going to put it in the same plant, put it in a bigger pot. It gets light, it starts making food, it starts growing roots, and those roots start growing, and the roots are nowhere near the sides of the pot. So over time, as you water, these areas all the way over here are staying really wet, whether you have a big gap at the bottom, whether you have big gaps at the sides. And the wetter this stays, the more of a breeding ground you're creating for the different pathogens that may cause rot. I forget, there's a Facilita. It's like some big word for this, like a very common type of bacteria that causes root rot. But you're basically just like creating this breeding ground because the roots aren't reaching all the sides of the pot and the soil is staying really wet. So there's ways to combat this. That's why we add like perlite. There's why we add, a chunky mix, is to try and keep these areas from like staying too damp. Like if you're just using your standard potting mix right out of the bag, it has a lot of peat. This just stays wet. The bacteria forms, it gets to the roots, and it just spreads throughout the roots. So that's why I say growing plants at home, if you're just using like light from your windows, I don't like going up too much bigger in pot size. Now, what's the other side of that is that I really increase my pot size in my grow tent. And the biggest reason for that, I'll do a great little graphic here. Very impressive drawing, Brian. I have so much light in there. The plants are growing rapidly in there because they're getting blasted with light. And I'm also using a specific type of pot for the most part. So I'm using pots that have holes throughout them. Sometimes they're called like self-pruning pots because people use them in the industry to like grow trees in the ground so that way they can pull the trees up. But they have holes all throughout the sides, completely around it, not just your normal drainage at the bottom. So how does that work? The same plant goes into a much bigger pot and it has its roots. And when I water this pot, water is able to escape everywhere. And it also, with the holes in the pot, I have a fan in there that's blowing. So yes, I'm pouring the same amount of water in here, but I'm not creating these pockets where those different pathogens can form. So therefore, this soil gets wet, it dries out drastically faster, and I'm also giving the plant drastically more light. So that means these roots are growing really rapidly, and I'm creating an environment where the plant can grow roots rapidly without becoming root bound quickly, but also not creating an area where there's anything going to form in the soil, in the substrate, that's going to cause any of these roots to rot. That's why I said like, once a plant's at like 6 months, if I up the pot size a lot, I can get it grow fast because I'm giving it a ton of room for those roots to grow and for it to expand and triggers whatever the triggers in the plant to know that it has the ability to grow as much as it wants without running any of the risk of these pockets forming. So that's kind of my mindset. At home, my plants stay in very, very small pots. I never use a pot too big just in my home. I probably could use those type of pots more in my tent, but in my tent, I basically have created an optimal situation where the roots have tons of area to grow. There's easy for me to hydrate the entire soil, but it's never staying too wet. This kind of also replicates some of their environment. Like, if they're growing on a tree in some kind of, wet forest, it gets really wet, the wind blows it off, it gets dry. It gets really wet, blows it off, it gets dry. So that's kind of the mindset there. The only other situation where I'd actually use maybe a pot like this is outdoors. I would do that in the summertime because in that case, it's really hot. My plants are normally getting more light when they're outdoors and they're absorbing more water faster. So the soil's drying out fast, the plant's using a lot of water. That's the only time I'll use like a really big pot like that without running the risk. But it's the same thing. It really comes down to light in that situation. And, it's also getting wind and temperature to dry out pots outside. So hope that clarifies. Just growing plants indoors, I never go too big of a pot. If you can get these type of like aero pots, I definitely recommend them for some of your more sensitive tropical plants, and especially epiphytes. Let me know if you have any questions. And look, I finally remembered it. Like and subscribe. Thanks.